So I'm just going to flip through.
Okay.
So my name is Adam Barrett, and I am a planner with the San Francisco Planning Department. I have been working on, with many others, on some of our sea level rise adaptation work over the last few years. I think you had a presentation from Diana Sokolov a few years ago. Is that right, Miles? Diana was here? Yeah.
Diana was here before. Diana was here before in your meeting.
I think,
Yeah. So I'm not sure what.
years ago.
Okay. I'm not sure what exactly she talked about, but I can give an update. We have been working. We're looking at this slide on the second page. In a frame that we call climate resilience, and we're talking about. Let me move over.
So you can see the camera.
Climate resilience, and what we're talking about here is both how we mitigate our impact on the planet in terms of contributing to climate change, and also recognizing that climate change is coming and is happening already in many ways in the city and in the world. How do we adapt our city to climate change? And that's where the sea level rise adaptation strategy falls in. And there are other climate-related hazards that we are also thinking about, including heat, air quality, wildfire, less applicable here, and other hazards, drought. So that's kind of what we're talking about. In 2016, then Mayor Ed Lee convened a group of city departments in a committee to discuss sea level rise, and that group developed this sea level rise action plan. And sea level rise action plan had a vision statement that said, make San Francisco a more resilient city in the face of immediate and long-term threats to sea level rise, to the Bay and to the Pacific coast, by taking measures to protect and enhance public and private assets, natural resources, and quality of life. So that's what we've been trying to do. You can see we also had this kind of step-by-step process that kind of lays out how we're going to start understanding first the science, understanding what's coming in terms of sea level rise, how high is it going to go, by when, and how far inland is that going to come. So what does that mean for San Francisco? So that was the first step. And then the next two steps, which is what we have been working on the last 2 years or so, is basically assessing the vulnerability of the infrastructure and assets and buildings that the city owns, which I can go into, and then what does that mean for people, for the environment, for the economy of the city. So that's the step that we're in now. It's here number 2 and number 3. And then from there, we're going to develop adaptation strategies and say, what are we going to do about it? So if you flip to this one, this is basically that first step. It says, well, what is the science saying about how much sea level rise is going to happen in the city? And so you can see by 2030, which is not really all that far away, a decade from now, you could get about half a foot to a foot more of sea level rise. And just by comparison, over the last 100 years or so, there's been about 8-9 inches of sea level rise. So that, it's equivalent to the last 100 years. And on top of that, you could have major storms and high tides. So even in today's sea level, you can see storms overtopping the Embarcadero, flooding the roadway, etc. So it'll just be a foot higher above that. By mid-century, you could see a couple feet, and plus about 4 feet or so of storms and high tides on occasion. And then by end of century, we might be talking about 3 to 6 feet. And there are actually updated projections from the state that have that even higher, or have the high end of that range even higher. And the range widens as you go further out, because less is known about how much people in the world will continue to emit carbon dioxide, but also how the Earth will respond to that. So what are those feedback loops? If the Earth warms and the permafrost melts, does it start warming faster, or is there some counter thing? It's not fully known the further out you go. So the range gets bigger, but in all scenarios, the sea is rising. So I think that's the important thing to note. And a lot of we're a coastal city. We're surrounded by water on 3 sides. We've got the bay and we've got the ocean, and they have different dynamics. And so, San Francisco, as a coastal city, really needs to start thinking about it now, and you know, end of century sounds like a long way off, but in terms of planning for and building and addressing these major, you know, infrastructure changes or land use changes, or places where you might have to abandon certain uses or move back or change the shoreline, it's a big undertaking. So it's something we need to think about now. So what we did, this is a little technical, but the first step, which I just mentioned, is understanding the exposure. So using those numbers that I just showed you, which parts of the city would be affected. That's the first thing we did. And the second thing we did was say, well, everything that's within that zone, that's the vulnerability, how will it be affected? How sensitive is it to flooding? If you have a park or a roadway, it might not be that sensitive. It gets flooded, and then the storm recedes, and it's fine again. But if you have a power station with electrical equipment, and it gets flooded, then it shorts out, and the power grid goes out. So, you know, or the treatment plant goes out. So there's sort of varying degrees of sensitivity and ability to adapt. So there's, for example, there's muni yards within the bus yards within the exposure zone. If they get flooded, you can move buses, but other infrastructure is more fixed and it's harder to adapt. So those are the kinds of things we looked at in terms of assessing vulnerability. And then the last piece we looked at was, what are the consequences on people and the economy and the environment? And we looked at that kind of, you know, individual, you know, a building or a rail line or whatever, but we also looked at how they cross. And so if one thing goes out, if a bridge goes out, then how does it affect the other things? If the treatment plant goes out, how does it affect the other, you know, types of infrastructure? So on the next page here, this is the map. This shows the area of the city that would be inundated by sea level rise at the end of the century, using that high-end projection on the earlier one, the 66 inches plus 40 inches of storm surge and high tides. So I think, I forget the exact number, it's about 3% of the city's land area. You know, it's a hilly city, so it doesn't go, you know, super far inland, but you can see, you know, the financial district, so much of Soma, Mission Bay, a lot of the Bayview areas around Escaldes Creek, some of the northern part of the city, and a little bit out by Ocean Beach.
Do you prefer questions after you're done, or?
No, whenever. But let me just say one thing about this map. This map shows, you know, what would happen if the city didn't do anything by the end of the century. So this is without any changes. So that's what we're talking about, is seeing that this is not the future that we have. So,
Okay.
please.
So,
Yeah.
my question is the area beyond the blue.
Yeah.
The flooding and stuff like that. Were all of those fill areas?
It's pretty, it tracks pretty closely to the areas of the city that were filled. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So, or filled, or yeah, wetlands, former wetlands.
so, what is the, or is the blue the original shoreline?
So, in this map, the blue line is showing the area of the city that would be inundated with 108 inches of sea level rise.
Blue is,
By end of century. It's the area that would be flooded.
108 inches of sea level rise.
Right, which is 66 inches, which is that high-end projection, plus 42 inches, which would be represent a storm and a high tide.
In this black form?
And so your question about the blue, is it the original shoreline? That's not what this map is showing, but if you looked at a map of the original shoreline, it would be very, very similar.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about the orange areas?
Oh, good question. So the orange areas are areas where there are development plans or infrastructure plans, like park plans. And those areas, those developments are building in sea level rise adaptation into their projects. So they're elevating their sites, they're doing kind of sloping open spaces towards the bay, they're raising streets, things like that.
So,
Yeah.
For you, if you want, I have an extra copy of the action plan for the previous meeting.
Great.
So it shows it a lot more in depth.
Yeah.
Okay.
There is more detail on all of this, but, yes.
Okay.
How long would the planning department involved with the idea of doing this, development? How long has it been in process?
This
Yes.
report?
hmm How long have you been deciding on how you're gonna go about it and just planning on it?
So right now, we haven't developed like specific strategies for most
One more
areas.
question.
but-
Okay, since you have not been, what brought you to the point where you felt it necessary to do this? Besides the fact that the sea level is rising, what was the number one thing that got you all to thinking, we ought to do something about this?
Well, it was that. It was
That was the only thing, right?
recognition that the seas are rising, and we need to do something about it, yeah.
There was no problem before until recently?
Well, I don't think it was fully understood how soon or how quickly or how extensively the sea was gonna rise until, maybe 5, 10 years ago.
5, 10 years ago.
So, when you hear this, always a couple of questions, come in your mind, like, is it related to the global warming?
Yes.
Some people don't believe in global
Yeah.
warming, and
It's true.
so, and then also, the prediction I see, and this one is like 6 inches in 2030.
Yeah.
How accurate is that? Maybe sooner than that, maybe
Yeah.
15 years sooner, or
So
10
I
years?
think-
Is it?
Yeah, I think to your first point, there's a pretty strong scientific consensus around the world that climate change is here, and
Yeah.
it is only continuing to accelerate, and we're going to see massive changes, and we already are in the forms of
Yeah.
the extreme fires, droughts, extreme storms, things like that. And sea level rise is a little slower moving, but on a massive scale. So, and
emissions-
to your second point, the projections, they are projections, but the nearer term ones are more certain in the sense of they're already, it's already been sort of put in place how much melting is going to happen. And so it's just a projection of how much melting across the oceans and how much that's going to rise. The further out projections are harder to project because we don't necessarily know how much melting or how fast the melting is going to
So
happen.
basically,
yeah.
6 inches not gonna be in 2030, that last year gonna be 6 inches gonna come up, it might be 1 inch.
Oh yeah,
in
it'll be
another 10
over
years.
time, and tides
2
go up and
inches
down.
in
But
another-
it's a mean high tide.
Thank you,
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah, an average tide.
Corinne?
Yeah.
Also,
I'm sitting here thinking about how folks approach this from sort of a messaging standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that there was a tendency, or maybe it had no impact at all, but when we're considering the projections, do you think there's a tendency towards like being more conservative because you don't want to overplay the game in the estimates,
Yeah.
or is there a tendency towards exaggerating?
Yeah,
how
or
to,
do they
to kind of create urgency?
or do they
Is there-
balance each other out? I don't know, but I can say one thing, that the state actually released new guidance recently that has a high-end scenario that is much higher than even the scenarios here, so it makes these look conservative, and it is sort of responding to sort of recent
Puerto
things that
Rico.
have happened about, glacial melting and permafrost thawing and stuff like that. So there is out there, the state put out there a much higher number pretty recently to say, hey, you need to start thinking about this much higher number.
May I have one more question?
I think she had a question, then we can go to you. Yeah.
Mine is more comment.
Yeah.
If I'm correct, we have right now a whole lot of development going on, or has going on. You got the UC Hospital, you got the Warrior Stadium. From what I can see of this thing, all of this development is falling right in this area.
That's
You know?
correct, and so,
And-
yeah,
and
and so
so
that's what
you
those,
have,
yeah. That's
you
what those
know,
orange circles are showing, so a lot of the
Yeah.
new developments are building,
Right
they are.
smack into it.
It is,
And
and
it's pretty, you
they
got-
are, and I think the new stuff knows enough to build up higher. The stuff that was done a decade ago or 2 decades ago is the stuff that wasn't built high enough. It was built slightly higher. Like
what
Mission
about
Bay
this
was
new
built, I
stuff?
think, 1 to 2 feet higher than the previous elevation, but that's not enough for this.
But what
So
about the new stuff like UC Hospital and all of those? Are they
UC
built
Hospital, I
higher?
think, is outside of
That's
this
outside
zone,
it?
but
What
the
about the
Chase
Warriors?
Center, the Warriors is
Chase Center?
inside it, but they are elevating the site.
That's what I
It's like
thought.
Pier 70 is
Mhm.
elevating behind a sloping
It's
arc
like, there's
and-
enough
yeah.
of it.
But I think the issue that brings up is then you have these sort of, they're not raising the roads around it or the utility lines around it or the sewer lines or whatnot. So the issue is you'll have these, these islands. If we didn't do anything else, we'd have these islands and canals or something. Be like Venice, yeah.
But it ebbed and
Like
flowed,
the-
right, with tide.
Well, yeah.
I'm pretty sure the Chase Bank CEO know that, right?
Yeah. Well, hopefully they're real estate.
When Diane was here a couple weeks, earlier last year and talked about this, the worst case scenario, that's what you're referring to, showed Chase Center and the UC Hospital completely surrounded by water.
Right.
And worst case scenario
Right.
back then.
Right.
Also,
Chase Center Island.
something to think about is what I keep going back to when I do my planning with other buildings is what the sea level rise going to do to our groundwater.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because our groundwater will rise too. And what will that do to buildings' foundations that now are not sitting in water, that worst case scenario could be sitting in water 100 years from now. So that's one thing I do every time I get an EIR or a building design in here. I try to find out information, to get that information out to the designers. We need to make sure that their foundations are going to hold under worst case scenario.
Yeah, and we also
Ready.
get
So if
earthquakes.
you don't mind, I actually have a few more slides that might answer some of these
Oh,
questions,
my.
so maybe I can just go through them and.
I just have one more.
Wait,
So,
wait. Thank you. My problem with that is, it's like putting in the furniture on the land where the house gonna be built on. I was wondering, how come you guys allow buildings to go, why didn't you just go ahead and take care of this first before you allow buildings to go there? If what she said is correct, and the worst case scenario coming, people moving to those places will have issues.
Right.
Big time. So it doesn't make any sense to me that you would build, that you would have construction and build up all this stuff unless you're using it as a cushion against the waters itself coming up. Whereas we won't be able to go further than those buildings. What sense does that make?
Okay, Reggie, the planning department doesn't build buildings.
I didn't say they did. I was just saying that, see, he's talking for the planning department. That's one. Since he's talking for the planning department, he's bringing the ideas to the planning department. Therefore, these are good questions that he might want to ask. Maybe they might give some answers to.
This
Well, I
is,
mean, we're gonna-
this is why when we had the port here a couple months ago, they talked about their seawalls and what they're doing with their seawalls. And at that time, we had last November the $500 million bond measure which passed to build bigger seawalls and stronger seawalls and raise the seawall around the ferry building that's 100 years old. And coming up this November is another $490 million bond measure to work on seawalls also along the port. So they're expanding their process to do the infrastructure build to help what the planning department's discovering in their research on sea level rise. So while they plan, other agencies are coming along in the building phase and doing the design plans now to build based upon their plan.
Based on that information, then I wasn't actually wrong for asking that question. It says they are in the planning commission.
They're
Therefore,
planning.
yeah, they're not building it, but they're planning it. So they're the one that planning, then builders come along and do the work after the fact.
So I do have some stuff about, projects that are underway, so maybe that will help answer that question.
just have
Yeah.
two questions. First, I leafed through, this looks like an interactive map. Was this generated by planning or some other entity?
Yeah, no,
And
we-
if I email you, can you,
It's,
can
yeah, but it's not actually an interactive map, but I can send it
It's
to you.
not
I can send it to
interactive.
you, you're welcome to email me and I'll send you what we have,
okay.
yeah. I mean,
And
it's
the
a-
second
yeah.
question I have is more, our combined sewer system,
Mhm.
okay?
So actually, let me
Thank
get to that,
Okay.
that, yeah. So, just quickly, this next page here has just sort of a number. Again, this is sort of what would be in that exposure zone with no city action by end of century in the high scenario. And it's just sort of a, gives you the scale of the magnitude of, what could be affected in terms of houses, jobs, miles of streets, acres of open space, public facilities, schools, things like that. So you can see when you get to the end of century, it's pretty significant, and there's even a pretty significant amount more near term. So what we did was we looked at all of these different kind of types of infrastructure: water infrastructure, sewers, public safety like fire stations and emergency firefighting system, transportation, port facilities, parks and open space. And we assessed the vulnerability of all of those, the different assets, the different buildings and roads and things that were within that zone. And we also looked at it by neighborhood. So for all of these neighborhoods along the shoreline, we looked at all of the things that would be affected. And then some of the key findings that we found, one of them is that you have a major transportation infrastructure that's within the zone. The Embarcadero Barton Muni Station, for example. A lot of the T-3rd, you have bridges over Mission Creek and over Islayas Creek. You have lots of Muni yards, Caltrain rails, freeway ramps, etc. And that this isn't just a local problem. The city can't solve it on its own. It's a regional problem. You have regional agencies like BART, like Caltrain. You have state agencies like Caltrans. And so that's really something that needs to be tackled holistically. Loss of open space is another big one. On the one hand, sea levels rise and it takes up open space. That's not the worst thing to happen because it's not affecting infrastructure or buildings. But on the other hand, open space along the eastern side of the city is largely at the waterfront and is a lot more scarce than on the west side of the city, and people could lose a lot of their open space. We talked a little bit about new development. You were mentioning the combined sewer system. One of the issues is that as the sea level rises, we have these creeks and waterways that come down, and when they flood, you need to get the water out. And when the sea level is rising, you have to keep the water out. So you're presented with a problem where you have a wall here and you have creeks. So that's sort of an engineering issue that kind of needs to be addressed. And the sewer system is largely gravity-based, although there are also pump stations which are within the sea level rise, and so it just brings up a lot of issues of the mechanics of how that system would work in the future.
So
I don't have the
know
answer
that
there,
you guys
but
are with the PUC.
yeah, PUC has been involved in this very heavily. Yeah.
But are they working to build two different plants? Because the two that I'm familiar with, one is along the Embarcadero, the yellow one is at the end of Ocean Beach near the Daly City border.
And the biggest one in the city is by Islayas Creek in Bayview, the Southeast Treatment Plant.
Right.
So I don't believe they have any plans to build new plants, but they are going to need to do things to retrofit existing plants as well as pump stations and channels and things like that. And then the last one is what Marvis was mentioning, was about groundwater. As sea levels rise, it raises groundwater as well, and particularly in the eastern areas of the city where there's lots of fill. We don't know where that groundwater is going to become emergent. We don't know what it will do to, toxins in the soil on like old industrial lands, and so that is, a sort of worrisome thing that we need to learn more about. And I know that Alameda County has been kind of doing a study of where the groundwater might emerge and how that will impact public health and safety, and so we'd like to do something similar. So just what we did was we looked at all of the areas in specific. I won't go through these, but like here's downtown. Here's this is kind of a mid-century scenario of what would be affected. Here's kind of Soma and Mission Creek, also mid-century. There's a lot of land there. And I'll just skip to this one, that we already, this is happening, and we need to start implementing stuff. While we're gathering information, while we're doing planning, we're also starting to make adaptation strategies. So over on Ocean Beach, you mentioned the treatment plant, and there's been major, issues with coastal erosion and beach disappearance. And so, there's a project there right now to close the sort of southern part of the Great Highway and build a sort of a more natural kind of landscape there to protect the treatment plant and create kind of recreational trails. And retain the beach there. We're also working down at Islayas Creek in kind of Bayview Dog Patch area. We just got a grant to kind of study ways to look at the whole shoreline there and what we can do to adapt it to sea level rise so that those areas don't get flooded. That area also already experiences flooding today. And there's a lot of sort of major transportation assets, muni yards and things like that there. And then lastly, the port, who I guess was here, has their seawall program that Marvis mentioned, as well as they're partnering with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to look at a flood study for the whole of the port jurisdiction that goes basically Fisherman's Wharf all the way down to Bayview. And that could potentially unlock the ability to get some major federal funding to build some adaptation projects and raise the elevation of the shoreline. And then you don't have to do that sort of building by building or road by road look because you've addressed the situation at the shoreline. But you might still want to do that for particularly critical assets because levees break and that sort of thing. So the city's already acting, and but we're also continuing to gather information into plan.
So I have a question about this slide.
Yeah.
I guess district by district or whatever. And my question is, Treasure Island,
Yeah.
and Upper Brainerd Island, Treasure Island being a man-made island,
Right.
was that also assessed?
So we didn't look at that because we didn't look at Treasure Island because there's basically the whole island is subject to a master development plan, and that master development plan did look into sea level rise, so we didn't separately do it. But yeah, I mean, it's all that Treasure Island would all be, and a good portion of that development plan, a good portion of the island becomes wetlands, becomes open space, that is essentially returned to the bay in some form.
So, the Treasure Island, is it Joint Powers Authority or?
Yeah, it's sort of like a redevelopment, its own redevelopment. It's a Treasure Island Development Authority title.